As I sped down the highway, heart racing at 140 kilometers per hour, I could barely focus on the road. My mind was back at home with Emily. Her voice had sounded frantic, desperate even, when she called earlier. She said she wasn't feeling well, vomiting, weak, barely able to stand, and begged me to come home. The memory of her panicked voice replayed in my head, making me press harder on the gas pedal, ignoring the screeching honk of cars I overtook. I shouldn't have been speeding like that. Hell, I could have been pulled over or gotten into an accident, but none of that mattered. My wife needed me, and that was the only thing keeping me going. By the time I reached our driveway, my hands were shaking, my chest tight with fear. When I flung the door open, the first thing I saw was Emily hunched over the kitchen sink, her skin pale as death, retching violently. I froze. For a moment, I didn't even know what to do. My hands trembled as I rushed over to her, touching her back, feeling how clammy her skin was. She gasped between dry heaves, her body trembling. "Call an ambulance," she whispered, her voice so weak it barely made it past her lips. My heart stuttered, and my mind went blank. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers clumsy as I dialed 911. "Please, I need help," I stammered into the receiver, giving them my address and Emily's symptoms in a rush of words. Within 3 minutes, help arrived. It felt like forever, standing there helplessly as my wife looked like she might collapse any second. When the paramedics came, they were calm, far too calm for what I was feeling. They assured me it was under control, but my insides twisted with worry. The ride to the hospital felt surreal, like I was outside my own body, watching someone else live through the nightmare. My hand held Emily's the entire way, squeezing it tightly, as if I could tether her to me through sheer will. At the hospital, the doctors ran a few tests, and after what felt like an eternity, one of them came to see me. "Food poisoning," he said, his tone professional but kind. "She'll be fine. Just needs rest and hydration." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling the weight of the day finally begin to lift from my chest. It could have been so much worse. I thanked the doctor 100 times over before heading back to Emily's room. She looked better already, her color returning as she lay resting. Relief washed over me as I stroked her hair. She smiled weakly, and I returned it, just grateful that we were both still standing. We got home late that evening. Emily was still exhausted, but at least she wasn't vomiting anymore. She moved slowly, her body fragile, as she made her way to bed. I helped her settle under the blankets, hoping she'd get a good night's sleep after everything. My mind was finally calming down, the terror of the day fading into the background, replaced by relief. But just as I was about to crawl into bed beside her, my phone buzzed. The sound was sharp, slicing through the quiet of the room. I picked it up reluctantly, seeing Boss Albert flash across the screen. My stomach tightened. Of course. I knew exactly why he was calling, and I wasn't wrong. "I expect you at work tomorrow at 9 a.m. You didn't finish today's task," he barked over the phone, his voice clipped, not even bothering to ask how I was or if everything was all right. "Do you hear me?" "I understand," I replied, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I had hoped, prayed even, that he'd give me a break, just one day, considering it was Saturday and that I had just spent the entire evening in the hospital with my wife. But no, Boss Albert wasn't that kind of person. His work came first, and there was no room for anything else. After he hung up, I put the phone down with a sigh. Emily glanced over at me from her pillow. "It's because of me, isn't it?" she said softly. I didn't respond at first. She was right, of course. If I hadn't left work early to rush home, I wouldn't be in this position. But still, none of this was her fault. "Health is more important than work," I said, more to convince myself than her. Emily gave me a faint smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes that she couldn't hide. I hated seeing her like this, fragile, vulnerable. It had been 2 weeks since we'd had any kind of intimacy, and tonight, after everything, I thought maybe we could reconnect, physically, emotionally. I leaned over, brushing her hair back, and gently suggested, "Why don't we have sex before we go to bed?" But she shook her head. "Not tonight. I just want to rest." Another sigh escaped my lips. It had been like this for days now. Every time I tried to reach out, she pulled away, retreating into her own space. I told myself it was just because she was exhausted, that she needed time to feel better. But deep down, something was gnawing at me. Something I couldn't put into words yet. We lay in silence, back to back, as sleep slowly took over. But even in the quiet darkness, that small, nagging doubt lingered in the corner of my mind. The next morning, I dragged myself out of bed, the weight of the previous day still clinging to me. Emily was still asleep, her face peaceful, as if the events of the day before hadn't left any lingering worries. I got dressed quietly, grabbed my keys, and headed out to work, expecting a long, grueling day. When I arrived, Boss Albert was already waiting for me, pacing by his office door like a drill sergeant eager to pounce. I braced myself for what I knew was coming. More pressure, more demands, more work that would drag me into the late hours of the evening. But to my surprise, he wasn't his usual gruff self. "Morning, boss," I said, forcing some enthusiasm into my voice. He didn't return the usual stern look. Instead, he handed me a short list of tasks, things that looked oddly simple. "These are for today," he said, his voice unusually calm. "Once you're done, you can head out and rest. I don't want to overload you." I raised an eyebrow, shocked. Albert never didn't overload anyone. The man was notorious for keeping us buried in work. I'd been prepared to spend my entire Saturday grinding away, but these tasks wouldn't take me more than a couple of hours. "Thanks," I muttered, still a little thrown off by his sudden kindness. He just nodded and walked off without another word. 2 hours passed quickly as I breezed through the assignments. By the time I finished, it was barely noon, and I couldn't believe my luck. I gathered my things, checked my phone to see if Emily had messaged, but there was nothing. I thought about calling her, but then an idea struck me, a way to make up for the stress she'd been through. Maybe this was exactly what we both needed after the rough day at the hospital. On my way home, I stopped by a small boutique flower shop. I picked out a gorgeous bouquet, filled with roses and lilies, vibrant and fresh. As I walked through the store, I spotted a bottle of expensive champagne sitting on display. It seemed perfect for the occasion, something to celebrate our quiet moment together after all the panic. I could already imagine the evening ahead. Candles, soft music, the two of us unwinding from the chaos. I left the shop feeling optimistic, clutching the flowers in one hand and the champagne in the other. But as I loaded everything into the car, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen. Boss Albert. "Damn, what now?" I answered, trying to keep the frustration from creeping into my voice. "Yes. You forgot your laptop at the office," he said flatly. I exhaled a long, annoyed sigh. I had been so focused on finishing the work and getting home that I'd completely left it behind. "I'll be right there," I muttered, trying to mask my irritation. After swinging by the office and grabbing the laptop, I was finally on my way home. As I got closer to our street, I slowed down, thinking it might be fun to surprise Emily. She didn't expect me home this early, and I imagined the smile on her face when I walked through the door with flowers and champagne in hand. A peaceful, relaxing evening lay ahead, or so I thought. I parked the car a little farther down the block to keep the surprise intact. As I approached the house, I noticed how quiet everything seemed. No sound of the TV or any movement inside. Perfect, I thought. She's probably still resting. I crept up to the front door, turning the key softly to avoid making a sound. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was hearing. A low murmur, soft but distinct, floating down from upstairs. My breath hitched in my throat as I strained to listen. Then it hit me. Oh God, yes, deeper, yes. My body went cold. I stood there numb, my heart thudding violently in my chest. My grip tightened around the champagne bottle as the unmistakable sounds of pleasure grew louder, the moaning more urgent. I knew what was happening. I didn't need to go upstairs to see it, but something primal in me took over, forcing my feet to move. "Emily's!" I shouted, my voice shaking as I stormed up the stairs. I could barely hear myself over the ringing in my ears. "Emily's!" When I threw open the bedroom door, the sight that greeted me seared itself into my brain. There she was, my wife, scrambling to cover herself, her hair a mess, her face flushed. Beside her, on our bed, was a man, naked, tall, muscular, and black, his clothes tossed carelessly across the floor. He fumbled for his jeans, trying to pull them on as I stood there, staring at the two of them like I'd stepped into some kind of sick nightmare. My world tilted. Everything I thought I knew shattered in an instant. Without thinking, I hurled the champagne bottle straight at him. It sailed across the room, hitting his shoulder with a dull thud, but didn't break. He flinched, raising his hands defensively. Hey man, calm down, he yelled, panic flashing across his face. I can explain everything. But I couldn't hear him. I didn't care what he had to say. My entire body felt like it was on fire, my mind buzzing with rage and disbelief. I just stood there, frozen in time, watching as my wife tried to cover herself, her eyes wide with guilt and fear. My hands shook violently. I wanted to tear him apart, to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stand there, stunned, as the pieces of my life crumbled around me. As I stood there, frozen in shock, Emily and the man shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of fear and guilt. I could feel a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, hurt, disbelief, but none of them seemed to fit. It felt like my heart had been ripped out and replaced with a hollow, gnawing ache. I looked down at the champagne bottle I had thrown earlier, lying on the floor where it had rolled after hitting him. Without thinking, I bent down, picked it up, and hurled it against the wall with all the force I could muster. It shattered instantly, the pieces raining down, a sharp contrast to the numbing shock inside me. Emily screamed, jumping back as shards flew across the room. My own voice followed hers, booming and raw. Why? Why did you betray me? Am I a bad husband? I needed answers. I needed to hear her say something that made sense, something that could explain why everything I'd built was crumbling before my eyes. Emily stared at me for a moment, breathing hard, her face flushed with emotion. Then, with a sudden sharpness, she said something that pierced through me like a blade. It's not you, she spat, her eyes glinting with anger. It's your penis. I blinked, too stunned to respond, but she didn't stop. Your penis doesn't satisfy me, she continued, her voice rising as she stood up from the bed. That's why I don't want to have sex with you. I don't enjoy it. My breath caught in my throat. Her words hit me like a punch, leaving me speechless. I stood there, dumbfounded as the truth sank in. All this time, I had thought it was just stress, exhaustion, or maybe even some medical issues she didn't want to talk about. But no, according to her, it was me. I wasn't enough. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man, the one she'd betrayed me with, barely holding back his laughter. His shoulders shook as he tried to suppress a grin. That sight, the smugness on his face, ignited a rage I didn't know I had. It flared inside me like wildfire, burning everything in its path. Without thinking, I grabbed the bouquet of flowers I had brought for her, the one I had imagined giving her in a moment of love and reconciliation, and hurled it at her. The petals and stems smacked against her face and chest, scattering across the floor in a mess of red and white. I expected her to cry, to feel shame, to show some sign of remorse, but instead, she erupted, her face twisting with fury. You son of a bitch, she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. You can't just throw flowers at me. Who the hell do you think you are? Her chest was heaving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen in her before. Get out of my house, she yelled, her words laced with venom. And don't come back until you have a penis that's at least 15 centimeters long. I was stunned into silence for a second. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her house? Her outrageous demand? The words rattled in my brain, too absurd to comprehend. But then the anger took over. What? I roared back, my voice cracking with disbelief. Your house? I bought this house. I did all the renovations. I paid for everything. And you have the nerve to call it your house? I couldn't stop myself. The bitterness flowed through me, words pouring out before I could even think. And you know what? You don't satisfy me either. Every time I put my dick in you, it feels like a goddamn elephant's been there before me. Her face went pale, but I wasn't done. Years of frustration, disappointment, and betrayal crashed over me in that moment. Everything I had kept bottled up, all the things I had tried to ignore, now exploded in the middle of that bedroom. For 5 minutes, we yelled at each other. Insults, accusations, everything we had never dared to say before. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, but neither of us backed down. And the entire time, the black guy just stood there, awkwardly shifting from foot to foot, still half-dressed, watching as we tore each other apart. He didn't say a word, just stayed on the sidelines like a spectator at a car crash, waiting for it all to end. He stood there, listening to every hateful word that flew between Emily and me. His silence was deafening, like a storm building pressure, waiting to explode. My heart was pounding, my mind a blur of anger, betrayal, and humiliation. The argument with Emily had torn something inside me, but seeing him just standing there watching like none of this concerned him, it pushed me over the edge. I snapped. "Why are you still here?" I shouted, the words spilling out of me before I could stop them. "Get the fuck out of my house, you fucking nig asteriskar." The moment the slur left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line, but the fury had taken control. I didn't care about consequences, didn't care about anything except making him feel as humiliated and small as I did. For a split second, the room went still, and then his fist came out of nowhere. He punched me so hard that the world spun. My body slammed into the floor, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. My head pounded, my vision blurred, but I could still hear him breathing heavily above me, could feel the weight of his anger pressing down like a physical force. "That's for calling me a nig asteriskar," he said coldly, stepping over me like I was nothing. I lay there, stunned, my cheek pressed against the cool floor, my mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to be the one in control, the one demanding answers. But now, here I was beaten down in my own home, humiliated while he held all the power. I watched helplessly as he grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the door. She followed him without a word, her face hard, resolute. The woman who had once been my wife was leaving with the man who had destroyed our marriage, and there was nothing I could do about it. Or so I thought. As they reached the front door, something inside me snapped again. It was like all the rage, the betrayal, the helplessness, all of it boiled over in that moment. I couldn't let him just walk out of here, couldn't let him leave after everything he had done. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet, my body moving on instinct. My hand grabbed the nearest chair, heavy and wooden, its legs scraping against the floor, and I swung it with all my might. The chair crashed into the back of his head, the sound of wood splintering as it connected. He collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the floor like a rag doll. The room filled with Emily's scream, piercing and raw. "No, no, what did you do?" she cried, rushing to his side. She knelt over him, shaking his limp body, her face twisted in horror. My chest heaved as I stood there, the broken chair still in my hands, adrenaline coursing through me. I hadn't planned on this. I hadn't planned on any of this. But now it was too late. The black guy was unconscious, blood trickling from where the chair had hit him, and Emily was screaming for help, her voice echoing through the house like some kind of twisted siren. "Shut up!" I roared, panic seizing me. I knew what was coming. The neighbors must have heard everything. She wouldn't stop screaming, wouldn't stop calling for help. But it was too late. Within minutes, I heard the blaring sound of sirens approaching. The red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and my heart sank into my stomach. The police were here. I was finished. The front door burst open, and within seconds, 2 officers stormed in, guns drawn, their faces hard and unrelenting. They took one look at the scene, Emily crying over the unconscious man, me standing there with the broken chair, and it didn't take them long to decide who the bad guy was. "Hands behind your head," one of them barked, shoving me against the wall. I didn't resist. I couldn't. My body felt numb, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around my wrists, and they hauled me out of my house, without a second glance. At the station, the interrogation felt like a blur. I sat there under the harsh lights, trying to explain what had happened, trying to make them understand that I wasn't the aggressor, that I was the one who had been wronged. But as I spoke, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They weren't interested in my story. They already had their version of events. She was fucking him in my house, I said, my voice desperate, almost pleading. I came home early, and they were in my bed. I lost control, okay? I admit it. But this isn't what it looks like. He attacked me first. One of the officers leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. That's not what your wife is saying, he replied, his voice flat. I froze, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. She claims you attacked her and her friend when they were trying to enter the house, the officer continued. She says you've been aggressive lately, and this time, you snapped. What? I blinked, stunned. She's lying. I didn't attack her. She was cheating on me with that guy. I caught them, and the officer cut me off with a raised hand. We've heard your side, but right now, things are looking bad for you. Your wife has already hired a lawyer, and they're pressing charges. The fact that she has legal representation is making this complicated. The floor felt like it was falling out from beneath me. My head spun. Pressing charges? You can't be serious, I said, my voice shaking. This is my house. My house. I'm the victim here. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before leaning forward. We believe your story, but you still assaulted someone in your home. And right now, your wife's lawyer is spinning this in a way that doesn't look good for you. I sat there, disbelief crashing over me. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? How had I gone from the wronged husband to the man being dragged through the mud by his own wife? I need my own lawyer, I demanded, the panic rising in my throat. Now! The next day, I found myself sitting in a courtroom, staring blankly ahead as the judge entered, my fate hanging in the balance. I had hoped, prayed, that somehow my lawyer could pull off a miracle, that the truth would come to light and I would be vindicated. But deep down, I knew the odds were stacked against me. Emily had hired a top-tier attorney, the kind of shark who made a career out of tearing people apart in courtrooms like this. My lawyer, on the other hand, was good, but he was outmatched. As the hearing unfolded, I felt like a spectator in my own life. My lawyer tried to argue self-defense, tried to paint the picture of betrayal and deceit, but it was no use. Every point he raised was swiftly dismantled by Emily's lawyer, who was far more experienced, far more ruthless. They painted me as the aggressor, a man who had lost control and attacked his wife and her friend out of rage. No matter how hard I tried to maintain my composure, I could feel the walls closing in. When the judge read the verdict, my heart sank. I had lost. The words felt like they were echoing through the room as the reality of it settled in. $20,000 in damages and 6 months in jail. 6 months. My mind spun as the sentence hit me like a hammer. I could barely breathe, barely process it. The only reprieve I had was the fact that I was able to post bail, another $20,000 I didn't have but somehow managed to scrape together. By the time I got home, the weight of it all finally crashed down on me. I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands as the tears came. I cried like I hadn't cried in years, all the anger and grief pouring out of me in a flood. How had it come to this? How had my life, my marriage, my home, all of it been ripped apart so violently? I had nothing left. Emily had won, and I was left broken, drowning in a sea of regret and shame. The days that followed blurred together. I barely ate, barely moved from the couch, the depression gripping me like a vice. I kept replaying the events in my head, how I could have done things differently, how I shouldn't have lost control. But it was too late for that. Emily was gone, and she hadn't reached out since the court hearing. No calls, no texts, not even a word of acknowledgement. It was as if I didn't exist anymore. Each day felt heavier than the last. The house was quiet, eerily so, and every corner of it reminded me of what I'd lost. I kept expecting her to come back, to offer some explanation, some final words, but there was nothing. Only the crushing silence and the weight of my own thoughts. A few days later, while I was half-heartedly watching some mindless show on TV, a loud, insistent knock echoed through the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard the voice. "Open up." You son of a bitch. I need to get my stuff. I dragged myself off the couch, my stomach twisting with dread. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. There stood Emily, glaring at me, her expression cold and detached. And next to her, of course, was the black guy, the one who had destroyed everything. The sight of him made my blood boil, but I bit my tongue, knowing there was no point in causing another scene. I stepped aside wordlessly, letting them in. They walked past me without so much as a glance, as if I were a stranger in my own home. Emily moved through the house with purpose, gathering her things like she was just running an errand, no emotion on her face, no regret in her eyes. It was as if the last few years of our life together meant nothing to her. I stood there, silently watching, gripping the door frame so hard my knuckles turned white. My chest burned with the urge to scream, to shout, to do something, anything, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But I stayed quiet, not wanting to provoke her. The humiliation was already too much. As she packed the last of her things, she turned to me, her eyes cold. "What are you staring at, small dick?" she spat, her words dripping with contempt. I swallowed the anger rising in my throat, forcing myself to stay calm. But before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my friend, but in that moment, an idea flickered in my mind. I answered the call, pretending it was someone else. "Yes, darling," I said, loud enough for Emily to hear. "I'm listening." There was silence on the other end of the line as my friend tried to make sense of what I was saying. I ignored the confusion and kept the act going, speaking as if I were having a conversation with some imaginary lover. I didn't care about the absurdity of it. I just wanted to see some reaction from Emily. When I hung up, Emily turned to me with a mocking smile. "Oh, you found yourself a new woman. Congratulations," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I want to disappoint you soon. This will be my house." Her words stopped me cold. "What? What did you say?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. "You heard me," she replied smugly, crossing her arms. "Soon enough, this house will be mine. You're losing it, and there's nothing you can do about it." The fury I had been holding back finally exploded. "Get out of my house!" I screamed, my voice cracking with raw emotion. "Get out now!" Emily and her lover didn't even flinch. They just walked out, the door slamming behind them, leaving me standing there, trembling with rage and helplessness. I knew she wasn't bluffing. She had already taken everything from me, and now she wanted the house too. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. As they left, a new feeling settled in my chest, revenge. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I was going to make sure Emily paid for everything. A month had passed, and my life had settled into a quiet, almost eerie calm. I hadn't left the house in all that time, not because I was hiding, but because I didn't feel like facing the outside world. In here, I could control the silence, the space, the distance from everything that had happened. I had come to terms with it, or at least I told myself that. Emily had taken almost everything from me, but she was out of my life, and that was enough. The days dragged on, but they didn't hurt as much anymore. The anger had dulled into something more manageable, a quiet ache that no longer consumed me. I was starting to rebuild, in my own way, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was beginning to breathe again. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. It was her, Emily. After everything, after the court, after walking out of my life, she had the nerve to call me. I stared at the phone for a long time, my thumb hovering over the answer button, unsure if I even wanted to hear her voice. Why now? I thought. What could she possibly want? Against my better judgment, I answered. My voice was cold, distant. "Don't call me. I don't want to talk to you." Then I hung up, the sound of the dial tone ringing in my ears. But it didn't end there. She called again. I answered, this time with more annoyance than before. "What the hell do you want?" There was a pause, and then I heard it. Her voice, shaky, soft, not at all like the woman who had walked out of my life with her lover on her arm. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But not by you, by him." For a moment, everything went still. I didn't feel the sharp stab of pain I expected, nor the fury that might have come rushing back. Instead, I was calm. "Congratulations," I said evenly, the coldness in my voice surprising even me. "What do you want from me?" And then she started crying. I could hear it, the way her breath hitched, the sobs threatening to break through. "He left me," she choked out. "When he found out I was pregnant, he just walked away. He doesn't want anything to do with me or the baby." I was shocked, sure, but I didn't feel sympathy. The man who had destroyed my life had abandoned her, left her to deal with the consequences of their affair alone. And here she was, expecting me to help her pick up the pieces. "Please," she begged through her tears. "I don't know what to do. I need help." I didn't even hesitate. K off, I said coldly, relishing the way the words cut through the silence. "You don't deserve any help." I hung up, and this time I blocked her number. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the phone in my hand. The same phone that had once been filled with messages of love from her, with plans for a future that no longer existed. But now, as I blocked her out of my life once and for all, I felt something unexpected. Relief. It was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt good, really good. She was finally feeling the pain I had endured, the same rejection and abandonment. Emily, the woman who had betrayed me, was now the one left alone, with no one to turn to. It felt like the universe had finally balanced the scales. She tried calling again, this time from different numbers, leaving messages pleading for help, for a chance to talk. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't that man who'd cling to the hope of saving something that was long dead. I even went so far as to change my SIM card, cutting off any possible way she could reach me. I wanted her gone for good, and I had no intention of ever looking back. A few months passed. The days felt lighter. Slowly, I allowed myself to step back into the world. I started seeing someone new, a kind, intelligent woman who seemed to understand that I needed time to trust again. With her, I was careful, cautious, making sure not to repeat the mistakes of my past. This time, I was in control, and I wouldn't let anyone take that from me again. A year flew by, and by then I had moved on. I sold the house, our house, and bought a new one, a fresh start in a place where there were no memories of Emily or the betrayal that had once shattered me. As for Emily, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. She gave birth to a black baby boy, but the man who had promised her so much had never returned. He left her as soon as he found out about the pregnancy, and from what I gathered, her life had taken a steep dive. She had lost friends, too. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who had lied, cheated, and ruined everything. She was alone, barely scraping by, working a dead-end job, trying to raise the child of the man who had abandoned her. In the end, she was the one left broken, and I was finally free.